All right, so welcome everyone as we begin a new book of Torah, the book of Vayikra. And Vayikra is very different than Shmos in its energy, in its content. And Vayikra is also known as the book of purity. The book of purity. In fact, there is a tradition that children, when they start studying Torah, the first verse of Torah they study is actually not the beginning, not Bereshis, but the beginning of Vayikra, the beginning of the third book of Torah. Not at length. In other words, it's not as if they start from the third book and then move through the third book, but the first verse, the first couple verses should be that they study of the Torah should be from the book of Vayikra, and then move back to Bereshis, to Genesis. Why? What's the logic to starting with Vayikra? So the Torah tells us the words of the words of the sages are Yavo Tehorim v'yisasku b'Tehorim. Let the pure ones come and study that which is pure. So the pure ones is a reference to children. Children are referred to as pure ones. They are pure from sin. They have a certain purity. We all understand that. But when they're going to start studying Torah, let them begin with the book of Torah, which is most pure, and that's the book of Vayikra. Because the book of Vayikra, the third book of Torah, also known as Leviticus, is the book which talks about the laws of sacrifices, talks about the laws of purity, beginning with the Torah portions Vayikra and Tzav, which speak about sacrifices, and then there's Shemini, which teaches us about the laws of kosher, Tazria Mitzora, which is the purity of which comes through the Tzaraat. So Vayikra, the beginning is somewhat ritualistic, and then later in the book of Vayikra, once you reach the Torah portion of Acharei Mos and Kedoshim and Amor, includes many very practical areas of life. In fact, the Torah portion of Kedoshim, which is one of the short ones, is also my Bar Mitzvah Parsha, may be the most practical Torah portion to live with altogether. But the first two Torah portions, Vayikra and Tzav, it's easy to kind of dismiss because it talks about sacrifices, and sacrifice seems to be something which is not that relevant nowadays. It's not very relatable to. So the question is, how can we take a section of Torah which is difficult to relate to and make it relatable? So I want to address that for a few moments, but what I want to do today, after that, is kind of cover some very basic information about sacrifices, give us a certain fundamental knowledge, because it's so essential in Torah, and because we have different types of sacrifices. You may have heard of the names. Those of you familiar with the wording of Torah, you'll hear the words Chatas, Asham, Ola, Shlamim. These are names of sacrifices. So without getting into the nitty-gritty details of the sacrifices, I think it's good to have some basic knowledge. In my house, I have several books from, I guess, a series called 501 Things You Need to Know. So 501 things you need to know about history, and 501 things you need to know about science, and 501 things you need to know about medicine, just so you don't look like an idiot, right? So that's in every field, there's a certain basic information, basic knowledge that you should know. And so that's what I'd like to kind of get into today, after we share some essential ideas and get into some of the basics when it comes to sacrifices. Okay, so let me begin with the Medrash. Again, the Torah portion begins, and you know what, let me jump to the Torah portion. I'll share the screen as we usually do of the Parsha. The third book of the Torah begins with the words Vayikra el Moshe, and God called out to Moshe, Vayidaber Hashem elav, and God called out to him, Me ohel moed lemor, from the tent of meeting, saying. Now, what this printout or this webpage does not show is something very significant, and that is that in the word Vayikra in the Torah, that last letter, the letter Aleph, is small. the Torah includes several, or I should say numerous small letters and large letters. Literally, it's a mini aleph. It's there. If you look in the Torah, it is smaller. I mean, the letter right afterwards is also aleph, but this aleph is small. And Talmud tells us the small aleph is a allusion to the humility of Moshe, because this word, as innocent as it sounds, Vayikra, is actually a word which shows tremendous accomplishment of Moshe. This word means God called out to Moshe, as if Moshe was so important. Moshe was so important that God called to him. And Rashi tells us that every time God communicated with Moses, it says Vayidaber, and he spoke, or Vayitzah. Here, when it says Vayikra, it means, there's a lot of brackets and parentheses over here. It basically means that he called out with a lashon chiba, an expression of affection. That this Vayikra is God calling to Moshe as an expression of affection. Usually we say God responds to our prayers, or God responds to the request of a prophet. Here, God initiated the conversation and called out to Moshe, which is a tremendous accolade to Moshe. And therefore, the very verse which speaks so highly of Moshe also has a small aleph to tell us of Moshe's humility. What's interesting is that in the book of Divrei Hayamim, the book of Chronicles, we find a large aleph, an extra big aleph. And that extra big aleph is put with the name Adam. Adam. The first man was Adam. Adam has an aleph. The first letter of the first name of the name of the first man, Adam, is aleph. Aleph is Adam. And in the book of Divrei Hayamim, the aleph is large, which indicates that Adam had a certain, perhaps, inflated sense of self. I don't want to call it arrogance, because Adam was very holy, but Adam had a certain inflated sense of self. That is represented by the large aleph, and it's that inflated sense of self which caused him to sin. As I've shared here before, and it's shared, anybody who studies Kabbalah and Chassidus will know that one of the things which we believe is at the core of a holy life is humility. Maybe the most essential quality to living a holy life is humility. And perhaps the most dangerous characteristic when it comes to sin is arrogance. So the large aleph represents arrogance. The small aleph represents humility. You have Adam and Moshe, both incredibly gifted people, both divine people. Adam allowed his divinity to get to his ego. And therefore, there's a large aleph, and that led to sin. Moshe maintained a small aleph of humility, despite his closeness with God, despite his unparalleled closeness with God. And that's why Moshe becomes the most accomplished person ever, the one who provides the Torah to the Jewish people. So God calls out to Moshe, and he speaks to him, Me'ohel Moed, from the tent of meeting. I'm going to skip these Rashis for a moment, and we're going to go to verse number 2. Verse 2, chapter 1, verse 2, the book of Leviticus. Daber el bnei Yisrael ve'amarta aleihem. Speak to the children of Israel and tell them, Adam ki yakriv mikem korban laHashem. When a man amongst you, a man or a person among you, brings a sacrifice to God, min abehema, min abakar, min atzon, takrivos korbanchem, from animals, from cattle, or from flock, you shall bring the sacrifice. So here we have the Torah introducing the concept of the sacrifices that people should bring. Now, we have had sacrifices in the book of Exodus as well as part of the inauguration of the temple. But here we have this idea that God is opening up and saying the idea of sacrifice is something which connects to everyone. Every person has the ability to bring a sacrifice. Now, at first glance, we don't relate to this. I mean, who over here relates the idea of taking a cow or a sheep or a dove or a pigeon and bringing it to the temple and having it slaughtered, and somehow that is a some sort of that is and to feel good about it. Why is that? Why is that a holy activity? So there's an interesting. Let me start with an idea, which is, how do we say this? Not the conventional Jewish approach to this topic. And what I'm going to share actually sparked a great deal of backlash. And this is the commentary of the Rambam, Maimonides. Maimonides wrote a book, in addition to his book, Mishnah Torah, which tells us all the laws of Torah. Maimonides also wrote a book called Moreh Nevuchim. He wrote a book called Moreh Nevuchim, which means the Guide to the Perplexed. And in this book, the Moreh Nevuchim, Guide to the Perplexed, the Rambam tackles some of the great questions that a philosophical mind may have when studying Torah. Of the philosophical mind may come to or will come to numerous questions, and the Rambam, and thereby leading them to be perplexed. So the Rambam said, let me give you a guide, a Moreh. Moreh means a guide. Nevuchim means those who are perplexed. A Moreh Nevuchim, a guide to the perplexed. And in that book, the Rambam takes certain approaches in certain elements of Judaism, which are somewhat different than classical commentary on Torah. And one of those is how he explains karbanos, how he explains sacrifices. The Rambam says in that book, in the Moreh Nevuchim, and I say he says it in that book because elsewhere the Rambam himself takes the more classical approach, which we'll get to. I'm starting with the less classical, and then I'll give the response to the more classical approach. Elsewhere, the Rambam himself doesn't give this explanation. But in the Moreh Nevuchim, the Rambam says that why did God give us commandments connected to sacrifices? He says because the Jewish people, when they left Egypt, were coming from a multitude of cultures, and they were in Egypt for 200 years, and there was a melting pot of different faiths and different paganistic approaches and styles. And God felt that the Jewish, and in many of those other forms of worship, animal sacrifice was very common. Animal sacrifice was the common approach in how they would worship their god or gods. The Jewish people were coming from that. They were highly influenced by that. In fact, as crazy as it sounds, within many of the ancient religions, human sacrifice was considered normal. The Torah talks about that. The Torah talks about forbidding human sacrifice. Who would think about human sacrifice? And yet the Torah and the Molech, the Torah forbids it because that's something that existed in the cultures that they had come from. Be that as it may, the Rambam in his Moreh Nevuchim offers an explanation that the concept of karbanos was a way that God felt the Jewish people would relate to that as a form of service. And therefore, God gave them mitzvahs which they would relate to based on their previous exposure and experience. That's what the Rambam says in Moreh Nevuchim. Now, the Rambam drew strong criticism for this. Many of the sages of his time were very opposed to this explanation. Most notably, the Ramban, Nachmanides, and others, and they drew from numerous sources in the Torah, which indicates that the idea of a karban is not simply a response to a pagan lifestyle the Jewish people were familiar with. And there's several sources. Firstly, there's several verses which indicate otherwise. There's the Ramban makes the point that we find Abraham bringing a sacrifice, and God deriving pleasure, so to say, from sacrifice from the forefathers. So the idea of sacrifice predates the Jewish people going out of Egypt. We have this idea of sacrifice in the era of the time of Mashiach. So the Ramban does not really, certainly rejects that explanation. And elsewhere, the Rambam himself seems to indicate differently when he writes this classical commentary on the Torah, not in his Guide to the Perplexed. The Rambam says that sacrifices are a foundational concept in Judaism. He says they are one of the foundational concepts of Judaism. Now, if if sacrifices were simply a way of the Jewish people being comfortable because that's the way they had previously worshipped, so then why would that be a foundational idea within Judaism? And then the Rambam elsewhere in that again, in this more classical commentary, says that karbanos are what he calls chok, are one of those areas of connection to God which may transcend logic. So the Rambam himself seems to, in his classical commentary on the Torah, use the more typical understanding of karbanos, unlike what he says in his Mor Nevuchim, in his Guide to the Perplexed. Now, one suggestion can be made about this. How do we reconcile the Rambam, A, with himself, and B, with some of the questions that the Ramban Nachmanides, pretty significant arguments Nachmanides makes, stating pretty clearly that the concept of karban is not just a reaction to pagan worship. So one perhaps simplistic way of explaining it is that the Rambam in his Mor Nevuchim, and this question comes up about other ideas the Rambam says in Mor Nevuchim as well, is that in the Mor Nevuchim, the Rambam was giving a person who was struggling answers to satisfy them for their struggles. And he said, look, if you have a hard time with the more mystical understanding of karbanos right now, if that's something which right now you're struggling with, perhaps this is an answer which will satisfy you. And this is something which can allow you to reconcile your philosophical approaches with the Torah and continue its observance. But the Rambam's approach, which he says in Mishnah Torah, which again is the approach of Ramban, Nachmanides, and the basic commentaries of Torah, remains the accepted understanding of karbanos, that it is an essential part of Judaism. And it contains within it a very deep idea, and it's not about an animal and a sacrifice, not because God is hungry for some sort of lunch. There is something very profound over here, a very deep idea, which we'll get to, what the Ramban says. But it's just interesting to hear some of the different ideas spoken about karbanos, because again, at first glance, the karban is a very strange concept. The idea that somehow bringing an animal is supposed to solve a human problem. All right, so let's talk a little bit. What is perhaps the mystical idea behind the karban? What are some of the classic commentaries? Let me share an interesting medrash which says like this: Tan Rabbanan, the sages taught, and this is not from, you won't find this in the Torah or even the simple reading of the Torah or Rashi. This is from the medrash. It says the medrash, Yom Shenivra Bo Adam Arish, on the day that Adam was created. On that very day, Adam sinned. When we read through the Torah, it may not be obvious, but the sin of the tree of knowledge, the Eitz Hadas, so it's known also as the original sin, wasn't sometime later. It was on the very first day that Adam was created. He sinned. Didn't last very long. He was given a mitzvah. Some say, and there's this commentary which says the obligation was only a short obligation until Shabbos arrived, and he couldn't hold into the temptation. Nevertheless, he sins. So what happens? Kivan sheshaka olav chamas. This is a medrash. When the sun set on that first day. Now, to you and me, when the sun sets, all right, no big deal. The sun sets because we're perfectly accustomed to the sun setting and the following morning, the sun rising. But for someone who was just created, who has no idea of what the world is supposed to look like, the sun setting is a pretty frightening thought. Not only the sun sets, there's no light, there's no electricity. If I may just take a pause for a moment to share, I mentioned no light, no electricity. As we are, my mother-in-law told me that today she's a author of a magazine, and she was in touch with a shlucha, one of the Chabad emissaries in Ukraine, the city of Kharkov. Her name is Mrs. Moskowitz. Now they recently escaped. They were there for as long as they could, and they escaped. So she spoke to her and she said, so what are you up to now? She said, what am I up to now? She said, now I'm on the phone the whole day. And he says, I'm getting phone calls from elderly residents in Kharkov who are in their apartment buildings. They're not leaving. They can't go anywhere. Old people, they're in their apartment building, 7th, 8th floor. There's no electricity. There's no food. And from here where I am, I think maybe she's in the US now, I don't know, says I'm busy trying to orchestrate food and food for these people. I mean, it's a fight against time just to get them food. So we certainly have them in mind in our prayers, and we hopefully even our Torah study today should stand in their merit. But anyway, back to this point. So no electricity. So Adam sins that first day, and then the sun goes down. So what does Adam say? He thought if you're sitting in a world, suddenly everything goes dark. What do you assume? All right, that's the end. It was nice, lasted for a few hours, and now we're done. The world ended. And that's what he thought. And he was sure that the world ended because of his sin. He said, God put me here and said, I ask of you one thing, don't eat from the tree. On the day you eat from the tree, you're going to die. And sure enough, I ate from the tree. The sun's going down. That's the end of the world. It's all done. And that's a lot. I think most of us would probably come to that conclusion. That's what he says. He says, Oili, because I ruined the world, because I messed up. The world now is dark because of me. And the world is now going to revert to nothingness as it was before. And that's what it was. Says the Medrash. He was sitting that night, through the night, fasting, crying the entire night. The Chava boiche kenegda, and his wife Chava alongside him crying. When suddenly they noticed the sun begin to rise, Omar, that's when he realized this is the way of the world. The way of the world is that there is darkness, but the darkness doesn't have to last forever. The darkness can be followed by light. And at that moment, Ahmad, he stood up, Vayikra, and he brought Shneur, an animal, as a sacrifice. Again, you don't see this in the Torah. The Torah doesn't talk about a sacrifice that Adam brought. But this is the matter says. He woke when he saw the morning arrived. He was uplifted, and he brought a sacrifice. Because Adam Harishon understood that the idea that there was night followed by morning was not just that this is the nature of the world, that this is the way God created the world, and that's why it happened. Rather, it is symbolic of human behavior as well. That God was saying, just as there is night, you sinned, and there was night, but there's morning afterwards. He said, this is symbolic of life, that God gives us the opportunity to have light after darkness, that there is darkness. Yes, and perhaps we bring about darkness, but God gives us the ability of light, and that inspired the idea of a korban, of a sacrifice, which reflected the idea of light after darkness. The idea of the sacrifice was that a person can ruin things, but a person then can correct it. That's what the sacrifice is about. So the sacrifice, and this is what the Ramban says, the sacrifice is a human experience. It's not an animal experience. It is a human experience, which is experienced through the animal, which is brought and bound and burnt and brought as a sacrifice to Hashem. And the first one to understand that was Adam. Adam, who was put in charge of creation, including all of the animals. God, the first thing God said to him when he was created, it says, Adam says, you are going to be in charge of all the animals. You are going to rule over them. In fact, it says Adam gave names to all the animals. So what does that mean, that Adam was placed to be in charge of animals, the animal kingdom? Not that Adam not that to give Adam authority. That's not the point. The point was that Adam was given the task of using the animal kingdom to bring everything under the one dominion of God. That's what the goal was. Therefore, the idea that Adam gave each animal names and gave animal names was that he was able to identify the unique divine spark within every animal. And he understood, and therefore the Hebrew name is a reflection of the divine spark of that animal. The Hebrew in English, the word for a horse is a horse. In Hebrew, it is sus. But the word sus is very different than horse. Aside from being a different language, the word sus, samach, vav, samach, contains within it a certain spiritual energy. And that is the spiritual energy of a horse. Adam understood that. And that's why he was able to name the animals. So Adam's goal was to not control over the animals as a form of authority, but to control and bring together the entire world, starting with the animal kingdom, and bring them under the divinity of God. And what happened? The opposite happened. The very opposite of what his job was happened. The animal he was supposed to bring the entire world, the animal kingdom, under the dominion of God. And instead, it was an animal which brought Adam under the dominion of sin. It was the snake which led Adam and then Chava, first Chava, then Adam, to sin, the one mitzvah they were given. So therefore, the very task he was given, he failed at. And not just failed, 180-degree failure. The exact opposite of what was supposed to happen happened. For this reason, once Adam came to see that there was light after darkness, that the sun went down, but the sun comes up again, he said, how do I rectify my mistake? By going back 180 degrees again. And if I bring an animal as a sacrifice, if I bring that animal, he chose, as the Medrash says, he chose an ox. An ox represented the king of the domesticated animal world. He said, I'll bring this as a sacrifice to God. The idea was, let me rectify, let me get back to the task that I was meant to do. And it's about me. It's not about, yes, there's the animal brought as a sacrifice, but the goal is the message that I take to heart from this. What is my task on earth? How have I moved away from it? And how can I use the process of bringing a sacrifice to realign myself with my divine mission here on earth, which is to bring all of the world, all of the kingdom of the world, humanity as well as the animal kingdom, bring them under and close to God, which is what a korban is. Korban represents the idea of coming close to God. So here we begin. We'll have to continue next week, which I think is fine because next week continues also korbanos. But here we begin to see how sacrifice is why it's such a fundamental concept in Judaism, even if we can't practically observe it nowadays. But we certainly can still speak about and understand its fundamental ideas, and we can still change us. The study of sacrifices can change us and cause us to be better people, holier people, just as it did Adam on the very, I should say, second day of creation, which was when the sacrifice was brought. So we'll continue this conversation next week about what the essence of sacrifices are. Thank you for joining me this week. God willing, we'll study. I hope to study next Wednesday, although I know it's the day before Purim, so there's a lot going on, but tentatively, let's assume that the class will continue next Wednesday. Nadia, good to see you and get to welcome you when you joined. And I look forward to seeing everyone again next week. We'll turn off the recording.